August 1975, Las Vegas, Nevada. The showroom of the Las Vegas Hilton, second show, 11:40 at night. A 19-year-old usherette named Linda Sue Foster stands against the back wall in a gold vest and black bow tie, a stack of souvenir programs pressed against her chest, trying very hard not to let anyone see that she is crying. She had worked the Hilton showroom for 8 months by then, one of nearly 30 young women hired to seat the crowds that filled that room twice a night, every night, for weeks at a stretch whenever Elvis Presley's name went up on the marquee outside. It was, by the standards of a 19-year-old from a working family in North Las Vegas, a good job, steady hours, decent tips from big spenders who wanted the best seats in the house, and the strange privilege of standing at the back of a room and watching the most famous entertainer in America perform close enough to feel the heat coming off the stage lights. Most nights it was simply work, tickets torn, seats pointed to, spilled drinks mopped up during the instrumental breaks. That particular night was not most nights. Linda Sue's older brother, Danny Foster, had been a helicopter crew chief with the 101st Airborne, and he had come home from Vietnam in the spring of 1971 in one piece on the outside and never entirely whole on the inside. The kind of damage nobody in North Las Vegas had a word for yet in 1975, the kind that showed up as long silences at the dinner table and nights he did not sleep and a temper that had not existed in him before he left. Their mother had done what she could. Linda Sue, 4 years younger, had mostly watched from the edges of it, too young to understand and too old not to feel the weight of a house that had changed shape around a brother who came back different. Danny had died in a one-car accident on a stretch of Highway 95 outside town in February of that year, 6 months before that August night in the showroom, and the county coroner's report had used the word accidental, and the family had let that word stand because the alternative was a great deal harder to carry into a Sunday church pew. Before Vietnam, Danny had been, by every account his sister ever gave of him, the kind of older brother who taught a 9-year-old girl to ride a bicycle in a graveled driveway one summer, who saved half his allowance every week without fail to buy her a transistor radio for her 10th birthday, who threatened, only half joking, every boy who ever came near the house to pick her up for a school dance. He had enlisted in 1969. At 19, the same age Linda Sue was the night she stood crying against that showroom wall, a detail she would notice herself only years later and find strange in a way she could never fully explain to anyone. He wrote letters home from Vietnam full of small, ordinary details, the heat, the food, a stray dog that had attached itself to his unit, careful never to describe the parts of it that would later surface, unspoken, in the silences and the sleeplessness of the man who came home 18 months after he left. Their mother, Ruth Foster, worked the switchboard at a downtown Las Vegas hotel and had raised both children largely alone after their father left the family when Linda Sue was 6. And by the time Danny died, Ruth had spent nearly a decade being the only steady adult presence in a household that had absorbed one hard thing after another without much room left over to fall apart properly. Linda Sue had taken the usher job at the Hilton, partly for the money and partly, she would admit, only much later in life, because the noise and the lights and the strict choreography of the work gave her somewhere to put herself that was not the quiet of her mother's house, where Danny's absence had become its own kind of presence in every room. Danny had loved one song more than any other in his life, a song he used to play on a portable 8-track in his bedroom before he left for basic training, and again, quieter, in the last difficult year after he came home, a song called An American Trilogy that Elvis had been closing his shows with for the past 2 years, a slow, mournful medley built around the old spiritual All My Trials and the Civil War hymn, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Linda Sue had heard it dozens of times from the back of that showroom over 8 months of shifts, and dozens of times it had simply been part of the job, background to counting programs and watching the exits. That night, for reasons that had everything to do with the date on the calendar quietly marking 6 months since her brother's funeral, the opening notes of that song moved through her differently. and by the second verse she was standing very still against the back wall, with tears running down her face that she could not seem to stop, no matter how hard she pressed her lips together. She had told herself, walking into work that evening, that she was fine, that 6 months was long enough, that she needed this job and could not afford to fall apart during a shift in front of 30 co-workers and 2,000 paying customers. She had believed it right up until the moment the orchestra swelled into that particular hymn and her brother's bedroom, the 8-track player, the sound of his voice singing along quietly off-key in the dark, all of it arrived at once, uninvited, in the middle of a Tuesday night shift. She had been certain she could get through. Elvis Presley from center stage, singing into a wireless microphone with his eyes half closed the way he often did during that particular number, was not in the habit of scanning the back rows of a showroom he had performed in more nights than he could count by 1975. But something, a flash of movement near the exit doors, a stillness that did not match the stillness of a listening crowd, caught the edge of his attention during the instrumental bridge in the handful of bars where the band carried the melody, and he had nothing to do but stand and let the music move. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. He found her without appearing to look for her, the way a performer learns, after enough years on enough stages, to read a room without ever seeming to study it. A young woman in a gold vest, standing very straight against the back wall, the way people stand when they are trying to hold themselves together through sheer posture, one hand pressed flat against a stack of programs, her face wet in the reflected light off the stage. He had seen that particular kind of crying before, in dressing rooms and hospital corridors, and once, memorably, at his own mother's graveside 17 years earlier. It was not the crying of someone overcome by a performance. It was the crying of someone who had been ambushed by a memory they had not been ready for. He did not stop the song. He did not point her out. He finished an American trilogy the way he finished it every night, the final note held and released into a wall of applause, and then, in the small pocket of quiet before the next number, while the house lights stayed low and the band shuffled sheet music, he did something that the crowd close to the stage barely registered, and the ushers along the back wall would talk about for years afterward. He asked in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the wings without carrying to the audience, for someone to check on the young lady at the back near the exit doors, the one in the gold vest. He did not name her, because he did not yet know her name. He simply asked that someone make sure she was all right, and that if she needed to step outside for a few minutes, nobody was to stop her or write her up for it. A stage manager relayed the request to the floor supervisor, who found Linda Sue still at her post, mortified that her moment of falling apart had somehow reached the stage, certain she was about to be reprimanded in front of the entire crew. Instead, the supervisor simply told her, quietly, that she could take 15 minutes if she needed them, that Mr. Presley had asked that she be looked after, and that nobody was upset with her. Linda Sue did not take the 15 minutes. She finished the shift because she had learned from watching her brother that finishing things, even hard things, even things that hurt, was usually better than walking away from them, a lesson she had absorbed from him without either of them ever putting it into words. But she carried the fact of that message through the rest of the show differently than she had carried anything into work in the 6 months since the funeral. The plain, specific fact that the man on that stage, in the middle of performing for 2,000 people, had noticed one 19-year-old usher crying at the back of the room and had used a few seconds of his own show to make sure someone checked on her. What happened after the second show ended is the part of the story that Linda Sue would tell for the rest of her life, more carefully than any other part, because it was the part she was least sure anyone would believe if she told it wrong. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and onstage guitar player, found her in the employee corridor behind the showroom as the crowd was filing out and asked, simply, if she had a few minutes, that Mr. Presley wanted to say hello before he went back to his suite. She was brought, still in her gold vest, into a modest backstage room where Elvis sat on a folding chair with a towel around his neck, the adrenaline of the show still visibly working its way out of him, and he did not stand on ceremony or make a show of the moment. He asked her name. He asked if she was all right. And when she found herself, unexpectedly, telling him the truth about Danny, about the 8-track player, about the 6 months since the funeral, and the particular cruelty of a Tuesday night ambush by a song she had heard 100 times without it ever doing that to her before. He listened the way people who knew him well would later describe as one of his most consistent and least publicized qualities, without interrupting, without rushing to fix what could not be fixed, simply present with the weight of what she was carrying. He asked her brother's name again, once she had said it, and said it back to her, Danny Foster, quietly, the way a person repeats a name they intend to remember. He told her that an American trilogy had become, for him, a song about carrying more than one kind of history at once, the sorrow of it and the survival of it both, and that if her brother had loved it, it meant her brother had understood something true about it that a lot of people who just enjoyed the melody never bothered to sit with. He did not tell her it would get easier, the kind of thing well-meaning people say to the grieving that rarely helps as much as it is meant to. He told her instead that 6 months was not very long at all, and that she did not owe anyone, including herself, an apology for a Tuesday night that had gotten the better of her. Before she left the room, he asked one of his aides to bring him one of the silk scarves he wore during his sets, the kind he was known for draping around the necks of women near the stage during ballads, and he folded it once and pressed it into her hands, telling her it was for Danny, not for her, a small distinction he seemed to think mattered. He also, according to the account she gave decades later to her own children, quietly asked whether she had ever thought about further schooling. And when she admitted, almost embarrassed, that she had once wanted to study nursing but had set the idea aside after the funeral because the family could not spare the money, he said nothing further about it that night, simply nodded, the way a man nods when he has heard something he intends to do, something about later, rather than announce in the moment. 3 weeks after that night, Linda Sue Foster received, through the Hilton's employee office and with no name attached beyond a note that read, "Only for Danny's sister," an envelope containing enough money to cover a full year's tuition at the nursing program at what was then Clark County Community College. The accompanying note, 4 lines long, unsigned, said that some things were worth doing quietly and that she should tell no one where it had come from if she did not want to, because the money was not the part that mattered. Linda Sue Foster went on to become a registered nurse, working for 31 years at what became University Medical Center in Las Vegas, much of that time in the cardiac care unit, a specialty she chose, she would say later, because her brother's heart had been the part of him that never fully came home from the war, even after the rest of him did. She kept the silk scarf for the rest of her working life in a drawer at the hospital, not displayed, not spoken of casually, brought out only on the anniversary of Danny's death, when she would sometimes sit alone in the break room for a few minutes before her shift and simply hold it. She married in 1979, a respiratory therapist named Mark Delgado she met during her second year of clinical rotations, and raised 2 sons of her own in a modest house not far from where she had grown up. She told her sons the story of the scarf and the tuition money only once they were old enough to understand it properly, sitting them down together on Danny's birthday one year in their early teens. And she would say afterward that watching their faces change as they realized what the story actually meant, that a famous stranger had noticed their mother crying and quietly decided to do something about it without ever needing thanks for it, was one of the few times in her life she felt she had truly passed her brother's memory forward intact. Ruth Foster, Linda Sue's mother, lived to see her daughter graduate from the nursing program and would tell anyone who asked that she had never fully believed the story of the anonymous envelope until she saw the tuition bill itself marked paid in full, at which point she had sat down at her kitchen table and cried for the first time since Danny's funeral, not from grief this time, but from something closer to disbelief that kindness on that scale could still exist in the world, and choose, of all the people it could have chosen, her own exhausted daughter. She told the story publicly for the first time in 2002, in a brief interview for a Las Vegas Historical Archive project, documenting the memories of Hilton showroom staff from the 1970s, and she was careful in that interview to say that she had never asked for or expected anything beyond the 15 minutes she had been offered and declined that night, that the scarf and the tuition money had come entirely from Elvis's own decision, unprompted, and that she had spent the better part of 30 years trying to live in a way that made the gesture worth what it had cost him to notice her in the first place. The interviewer, at the close of that segment, asked her directly why she thought a man performing 2 shows a night for thousands of strangers would bother remembering one Usher's face at all. Linda Sue considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think he knew what it was to be looked at by everyone and seen by almost nobody," she said. "And I think that made him pay closer attention than most people ever bother to whoever was standing quietly at the edges of a room." There is no plaque inside the building that once housed the Las Vegas Hilton showroom, itself renamed and remodeled more than once in the decades since. What remains is a folded silk scarf in a nurse's memory box, a nursing license earned a year sooner than it otherwise would have been, and the plain specific fact that on one ordinary Tuesday night in 1975, in the middle of a show he had performed 1,000 variations of, a man who had spent his entire adult life being watched by everyone still found a few seconds to watch carefully for the one person in the room who needed to be seen. If this story of a quiet moment inside a Las Vegas showroom stayed with you, it is worth sitting with for a second before you scroll on. Have you ever been the one falling apart in a crowded room, certain nobody noticed, only to find out later that someone had? Tell us about it in the comments. We would genuinely like to know. And if stories like this one matter to you, consider subscribing and leaving this video a like. It helps more people find the quieter, truer side of who Elvis Presley actually was behind the stage lights.